Welcome to the second event by the Student Publication Association. I'm Maurice Alexander, the Scottish Regional Officer, and today we'll be having a panel discussion on the topic of free speech and expression and so forth, with Oliver Pike, who's the founder and editor of Monolith Media, Holly Jennings, who's the editor-in-chief of the Glasgow Guardian, and Rafe Uddin, who is a parliamentary reporter for the Scottish Parliament. And, I suppose the reason why I started the discussion would be just because it's very topical, freedom of speech. It's very spoken about in the media a lot. There's some very interesting court cases here and there. And it just seems to be like a hot topic right now, especially like on university campuses and whatnot. And I suppose with the first question, we'll just start with the definition itself. It's free speech defined as the power or right to express one's opinions without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty. And I suppose it would be, do we agree that that should be something everyone can possess? Why not? And I suppose we'll start with Holly.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for organising this. I think this is a really interesting topic with what's going on. In regards to your question, I think the concept of without legal penalties a really interesting one to bring out. Just because, of course, I think sometimes this sort of expression is taken at face value for that it means that people can just say whatever they want whenever they want, when that's not what I interpret this kind of law to be. I think that there obviously is restrictions on free speech at times, and I'd agree that quite often this is necessary.
Right. Well, I suppose we'll move right on to Oliver then, because Oliver has written quite extensively about freedom of speech.
I would say freedom of speech should be extended up to the point where someone's being defamed or there's incitement to violence, and that's a very high bar if you look at the Brandenburg v. Ohio case in the US. And I think you need to have a principled take, because if you use whether it's truth or offense or hate, these things don't have legal definitions, so it's very hard to apply that to every piece of speech. And then you give power to someone, whether it's the state or it's Twitter or it's a mob, whether it be cancel culture. And I think it's interesting the definition distinguishes between censorship, restraint, and legal penalty, because it's not always coming from the state. A lot of it comes from universities or cancel culture from the mob.
Well, it's a very different opinion there. And I suppose we'll move on to Rafe as well. What's your thoughts on that, the definition of freedom of speech and how it sits with most people?
I think we're in a sort of, I guess we're living in an era where the focus we have on free speech perhaps is a bit too sort of centered on newspapers and columnists, and we talk about sort of a cancel culture and we talk about mobs. I'm not sure that's necessarily the right way to perceive it. I think the public seem to be somewhere else with this. They see abuse, and if you look at YouGov polling quite recently, where the majority of people polled will say that they're more concerned about the issue of abuse than just having someone speak freely. I also think when we talk about free speech, it's important to frame it within the sort of legislative landscape and also within the sort of understanding that prosecutors and, if anything were to go to the courts, there's always a deference to Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention for Human Rights. And there are legal restraints within that convention, but it's also fairly free and fairly all-encompassing. And then it's been used by journalists oftentimes to challenge decisions that are made in domestic courts. So we've had situations where, Section 7 of the Terrorism Act, which allows for sort of search at the border, that's something that the Court of Appeal was able to challenge on the grounds that it was a breach of, Article 10 rights in the European Convention. I think we've got a very strong legislative security there.
Well, that actually blends quite well into my second question, which I suppose I'll direct to Oliver. do you think the pro freedom of speech side is getting caught up in abstracts and matters of principle and whatnot, and not really not really focused on the ground effects of totally free speech? Because Rafe basically said that we're pretty free already, and we can say pretty much what we like as long as it's curtailed within abuse. Is that something that you'd be all right with? Do you think that's something
as it stands, I mean, we've had comedians locked up, we've had journalists locked up, people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, they're still, on the run, essentially. And I think you have to be principled when it comes to free speech, because you cannot, it's all subjective. You have to apply objective standards. And I think some of the negative things, like the conspiracy theories, mistruths, hatred, whatever it may be, you have to take that as part of the parcel. Karl Marx referred to free speech as a rose. You've got to clasp the thorns to get the petals. So, and I think the free marketplace of ideas can also air these bad ideas and challenge them. And when you censor things and kick things off the internet or out of universities, then you free them from opposition. And when it comes to abuse and people harassing one another, that is already covered by the law. So verbally assaulting someone is different from saying something that is generally hateful.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting answer. Basically, there's a difference between speech that leads to harm and speech that leads to offense, and I'm interested in Holly's response to that. Like, do you kind of make a distinction between the two, between airing concerns about issues and problems which the proponents and the propositioners of these ideas might find offensive, that being questioned? Like, how would you deal with that, like the proper kind of discourse behind ideas?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think that it's not really right in a way to think that when you write something that there won't be any effect. And I think too often there is sometimes a notion from these columnists that they can, like with this pro freedom of speech notion, that words, it almost it counter argues a little bit, because words are very powerful. And I'm sure as people interested in journalism, we can all agree on that we don't write pieces and hope that someone walks away thinking, I'm completely unaffected by that. So I think that they do have a certain power. I would agree that there's a notion, or I'd say that there's a notion that how we interpret that affects us is very personal. We kind of co-write our own meanings into it a lot of the time. But nevertheless, just because someone writes, 3,000 words on why, for example, me might be a terrible person, I might be okay, well, that's fine. Someone else, that could really impact them. And I think, yeah, those words have that power. A lot of it is how much we give that power to them. But I think offense and harm's a really fine line. I don't think we can really sit here and act like our words don't do anything.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of discussed the question of abuse and verbal assaults and offense and whatnot, but I thought about this question when I was actually writing up this list. Why should the average person care about someone being verbally assaulted? Why should they care about someone's offense? And why should, sort of speech be curtailed because someone dislikes the opinions of someone? You know what I mean? It's sort of why is that sort of a central column in a lot of the anti-free speech statements? I'll direct that to Rafe, and then we can each have a take on that, perhaps.
I always sort of struggle with this. I don't really see it as quite so dichotomous. I don't see it as pro freedom of speech and anti freedom of speech. I think there's the spectrum of views, and the majority of people aren't really on an extreme side of either thing. I think most people generally understand that if someone is threatening or abusive towards someone, that's not on. Particularly, when we're talking about journalists, threats to journalists for doing their job, particularly when I mostly think about my investigative colleagues and colleagues who are working in that space. Threats of harm and risk to them for, revealing something or showing something or delving into something is not something that the public approve of. Most people don't see that as an acceptable thing to do. And when we talk about why the public might care, I think most people are fairly empathetic. I think they understand, human experience. They don't want things done to, them that are being done to journalists in that sense. And that goes for lots of columnists who might be writing something. It's not necessarily something that is so pressing for me, but I think most people appreciate that. No, you can't go and harass someone. You can't threaten someone. We've had cases of Joanna Cherry recently. That's someone I don't agree with in a policy sense, but no, I don't want her to receive threats of abuse from random strangers on the internet. I think it's inappropriate. I think that's where the public are.
Maurice, I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, definitely more of a human element then, quite the weight that the human arguments, human emotions and feelings have regarding the speech of others. Oliver, what's your take on that? Do you think someone's offence or hurt has a lot of weight in these arguments?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about, whether it's a assault or someone being offended. They're very two different things. If someone sends a death threat, that's different from somebody being offended by a joke or maybe some political advert or something like that. And when we had insult laws which were removed, I mean, we had Peter Tatchell was arrested. He was a gay rights activist speaking out against the treatment of homosexuals in the Middle East. We've had Count Dankula up in Scotland, YouTube comedian, dragged into court because somebody subjectively found his joke to be offensive, and the court said that it didn't matter whether it was or not. It was whether someone found it offensive. So I guess the question is, who gets to decide where the line is drawn when it comes to offense, and how is that not open to abuse? And then also I'd say that the sort of death threats, the abuse, the harassment, that's a tool used by the mob to silence people that they disagree with and shut down free speech. So Joanna Cherry was a fantastic example mentioned there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. Holly, you sort of raised an eyebrow at the start when we spoke about without legal constraints. If you're going to have a legal restraint on people's speech, how would you sort of prevent that from being abused and suddenly used against some people and then regime change and it's used against another group?
I think that's a tough question. I think that's something we're definitely experiencing at the moment. I agree that, but you look at all areas of law and things are bent into shape to make different defenses work and all that different stuff. I'm not saying that's okay, but I certainly don't have the answer for how do we stop this sort of thing happening. One thing I do want to pick up on is just something you said there of just looking at it from a human angle. And I think it's important to focus on that, and that surely it should always kind of be looked at through a human angle. This is a human law, it's human rights. And I think to look at it without emotion or without that consideration of morality and or empathy is wrong. I think we have to consider those parts of it too.
Rafe, you're a parliamentary reporter, quite close to politics and whatnot. Do you think these legal constraints could be twisted and moved around to fit different political agendas?
I mean, yeah, of course. I think any sort of legal any piece of legislation is something that's brought in by, unless it's a private member's bill, it's being brought in by the government of the day. Something I've covered extensively and sat in on all the evidence sessions for is the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland bill, which is currently going through the Scottish Parliament. And that's something that the Scottish government's brought forward, and now it's undergoing extensive amendments because the phrasing of things needs to be tightened up. The protections for free expression, in particular, is something that they've just not gotten right. It's something the government's accepted. It's something the opposition's accepted. There's a sort of, there needs to be an emphasis on getting good laws passed. But there also, I think, importantly, we also need to be talking about what happens when, the law isn't really protecting people enough? Are we providing necessary legal aid provisions for people? You know, are people being taken to court for things and then facing financial ruin? I always perceive that as a greater chilling effect than just the law in and of itself. If the justice system is faltering in that regard, that's more problematic for me.
Yeah. Well, I've got my questions on my phone, so that's why I'm looking down in case anyone's wondering that. Basically, well, a common kind of defense about, you know, on people that are really pro like unrestrained speech is that an intelligent debate always solves the issues. Kind of like what Rafe picked up on in the Scottish Parliament. It was proposed, it went through all of the rigmarole of like both sides and both like by the proposition and the opposition, and it's more about, do you think an intelligent debate's a good defense now for all discussion, especially in like the era of like sound bites and sort of a lot of like online propaganda, you might think. I mean, when I think about this, I think, you know, chiefly of like the Q cults in America, where people are really holding on to these sorts of ideas that there's a big conspiracy and it's all largely about, you know, detached from reality. And I'm wondering, do you still think an intelligent debate on the public sphere is possible, or does it need to be, or is it more like within a group like politicians and whatnot? I'll pass that to Oliver.
I'd say that politics has always really been about snippets and sound bites, but the internet being sort of a new tool that we can use, I think it's actually made free speech less dangerous, not more dangerous. I mean, it's allowed people to commit crimes, but that's covered by criminal law. In terms of free speech, people are now able to fact check things far quicker. They're able to listen to thinkers and podcasters from all across the world, start blogs. It's easier than ever to do your own sort of thing. So free speech has never been more available to people, and I think people are capable of fact checking and sort of researching for themselves.
Holly, what do you think about that? People being capable of fact checking for themselves and researching every point they hear. How do you feel about that?
It's interesting to consider, obviously, in an era of fake news as well. And I think our job as journalists, all of us, is to ensure that the information that we're using is correct, because too quickly things can spread. And I think that aren't true. And I think, yes, we do have more access to that information, but there perhaps, I think it's really important that we as these big news institutions, even small institutions, are there for those factual elements, because I can tweet out anything I want, and there needs to definitely be an understanding that just because you read on the internet doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah. Well, going on to like fake news and everything, that's a very topical issue, but it's also, everyone's familiar with the idea of like no platforming. Basically, you don't want to give air to certain views, and you think these are sort of like undesirable to speak about. They might be quite like old-fashioned and out of touch and out of date. So you sort of collectively decide not to kind of give them a platform. How do you feel, or even if they're very hateful as well, like how do people feel about like no platforming, the sort of conscious decision to disallow people from speaking about certain topics? I'll pass that to Rafe.
I mean, I feel like that's a challenging one, isn't it? I think that most newspapers and publications are, you know, we have controls in place, and we try to, in my field, it's you're trying to encourage truth and facts. And I mean, I'm very fortunate. I don't really have to participate in debates or have to sort of look at people's opinion pieces anymore. That's something I used to do when I was an editor. You know, I've often sort of thought that it's important that you can defend the work that you're publishing, even if you don't agree with it. Sometimes I've had situations where people have written something that's perhaps gone, you know, moved a bit into the area where it's not really facts anymore, or truthful, or honest, or it's moved to the extreme, and you have to have conversations with those people. I think some people, depend on the extreme. And then it's up to a publication whether or not they're going to publish that extreme view. For me, it's always been the case that you need to be able to say, I don't agree with it, but I can see where they're coming from. I can appreciate that view, and it's not a risk. Especially, I think you've got to think about safeguarding and the welfare of your team as well. It's not a risk to your team, an unnecessary risk. And we weigh up risks a lot when you're making an editorial decision.
How do you feel about like no platforming, Oliver?
In terms of on a publication, the publication is run by the editors there, so that's up to the publication to run their own affairs and publish what they want to publish, and then be rightly criticized or denounced or whatever needs to happen if they publish something that's bad. In terms of no platforming speakers, the rule should be if someone's invited and there's an audience willing to listen to them, then they should be allowed to speak, and if people disagree, then they can come along and challenge them. A great example was the BNP leader Nick Griffin when he went on to Question Time, and they just tore him to shreds, and it pretty much destroyed his career when he went on there. He was a laughingstock after that. So I mean, this happens all the time. Bad views get challenged and made a mockery of, really, in the free marketplace of ideas.
Holly, what's your take on that? No platforming and whatnot.
Really controversial in this. When we think about social media, especially, we've seen quite a few recent cases of big style no platforming. But of course, people improvise, adapt, overcome with that kind of thing. We've seen Parler, that new app. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Which is what a lot of kind of far right people are now using. And is there a danger that when we block people off other platforms, that they will then go and create their own, where it becomes a bit of a hub of the same kind of ideas being generated? That's something I think we need to think about. It's challenging because I think sometimes with the people who are no platformed, a lot of the reasoning is to do with tolerance or intolerance rather in accepting other ideas. So I think there's room for a lot of people's views on these social media platforms, but when it becomes a point where the people saying it are intolerant to hearing other ideas, or it does become dangerous, then we need to think about how we manage that, because they can be extremely influential. I mean, we saw what happened with tweets in the Capitol, didn't we?
Yeah, that's a very relevant point.
Can I just add something about Twitter? I mean, and Parler, that is definitely going to create these sort of echo chambers left and right, and that's just going to divide politics further. In terms of how you regulate free speech in these platforms, because they are now so important to public discourse, there's been suggestions they should be treated as almost a public square or regulated as a public utility for the purposes of free speech. So Poland's introduced a Freedom Act implementing fines if people are no platformed, and I think it's only Polish citizens, I believe, so I don't think Trump's going to find any assistance in Poland.
Yeah. Well, yes. About association and whatnot. It seems like we're all pretty, clued in and pretty in agreement that these platforms can freely associate with who they like and host who they want as well. See on your own, if you've written for, I know Rafe isn't in charge of a publication, but he's written for one before. Have you ever rejected articles based on the content that you thought were not meant to be aired yourselves? I'll throw that to Holly. Have you ever done that?
Well, yeah, but I think a lot of that is not someone writes something for me and I think, no, that's not true. Well, or, oh, I disagree with that. It's never really been on the basis of disagreement of opinion, unless it's been something like hate speech or really discriminatory. If I reject something, it's because something was false. As simple as. So, I mean, I've published pieces that are completely different political views from mine, but they were rooted in facts and they were true. So why would I reject that? But yeah, we have to, because not everyone who writes something is using those facts a lot of the time,
What about you, Oliver? Would you ever not publish something because you thought it crossed the mark or anything?
I mean, there are certain limits for your own publication, but when talking about whether people should be, punished or criminally prosecuted for putting something out there, so long as it's not defamatory, inciting violence, or criminal in any way, in terms of like terrorism or something like that, then it should be fine. But broadly, I mean, if things are untrue, you don't want to put them out. But I think people should be willing to challenge the orthodoxies that are put out there in the media and be a sort of lone crusader. I mean, people like Peter Hitchens, for example, take very fringe positions and get attacked for them. And people call for him to be censored, but he keeps making his point, and people are free to argue with him.
Well, we've mentioned things like Parler before, and we kind of recognise that that's a place where all these far right people are going. So they're leaving or being kicked off of one platform and going to a much smaller platform where they sort of all talk amongst each other and sort of big each other up in these sorts of views. And then Oliver brought up the idea of having a public square. So let's just have a bit of fantasy for a moment. Do you think the government should, or someone should, force all of this online discussion on one place where it's always going to be, like some sort of run it as a public utility almost, and make people use the one platform in which they can then discuss? Or do you think that infringes upon their own personal rights? Or what's your thoughts on that? I'll pass that to Rafe.
I mean, I just think, I don't know, if you're talking about a sort of single public utility social media network, I think you'd probably upset a lot of people at several social networks. I think people choose the networks that they want to use, and we regulate those spaces in certain ways because we talk about threats of abuse and so on and so forth. I think it was interesting, Oliver Dowden, who's culture secretary, has signaled that he's considering fines for social media networks, considering even the prosecution of senior management team, of senior executives within those social networks, where they don't stamp out and root out forms of abuse online. I think that sort of goes counter to what those social networks are as public spaces, perhaps. But it's also, I think Oliver's raised it, and Holly's spoken to me about this in the past, and you do get echo chambers. You do end up with this sort of very narrow lens of things. It's not, I think if you wanted to visualize a public space, a social network as a public space, you'd be looking at a very cramped square full of people yelling a lot, and not much by the way of debate and conversation happening. So I don't know if it's good to conceptualize it as a public space, and I don't know if it's good to think of it as a sort of singular utility, because I think that would perhaps narrow conversation in some ways.
What's your thoughts on that, Oliver?
I mean, there's sort of, they are private companies. They can, at the moment, do what they want to do, and they have publisher protections at the moment. There's been a whole argument whether they're acting like publishers or not. And if you look at the fact that they allowed articles about Trump's tax returns, which were hacked, to be published, and then previously had said that the story of Hunter Biden's laptop wasn't allowed to be published because that information had been hacked, even though it hadn't been. So there was essentially inconsistent decisions being made by Twitter, and they're now essentially deciding what is and is not news, what is and is not true, and what is and is not acceptable. And therefore, Jack Dorsey and people like him now control democracy and discourse. And I think it's even more concerning when you look at how government gets into these companies. Nick Clegg's a perfect example. You think he's the policy advisor for Facebook or something. These politicians, once their careers are over, go and work for these big companies. So there's a strong link between government and big tech. And they're now having so much power to control discourse. So now the government by proxy can control discourse as well.
Rafe, what's your thoughts on that these tech companies are controlling democracy and are having too much influence on the political sphere through their social media platforms?
I think most sort of MSPs and MPs aren't necessarily using social media to inform their policy choices. I think even the Labour Party more recently has gone a bit more offline because they don't want it. I wouldn't really overplay Nick Clegg's role in anything really, including politics. I wouldn't over-egg that because I don't think he had much influence when he was a PM, and I'm not sure how influential he is at Facebook. But I think Oliver's got the point. In some ways, we've got Nick Clegg at Facebook. We've got George Osborne at the Evening Standard. We do have to be cautious about a revolving door between the media and politics, and a revolving door between big tech and politics as well, because as we've moved away from traditional forms of media, and now we're getting more and more information from social networks, if that revolving door continues in that way, it does raise some concerns.
Holly, what was your thoughts on the idea of trying to sort of solve that echo chamber issue with having like a one public square, just that sort of idea of like having one place where everyone discusses things online? What do you think that would change much, solve some issues?
I think that's a difficult notion. I think that if we're going to properly try and tackle these issues, we need to make sure that there's representation for all walks of life, and all different kinds of people. And I have to agree with what Rafe said. I think that it would probably just turn into a lot of angry people shouting. And, I don't know how to properly fix that issue. I do agree that people are going to gravitate towards whatever they want to. These people gravitated towards Parler. I do think is a serious danger of those echo chambers producing something really dangerous. But in the same way that we gravitate towards certain people or that sort of thing, it's what we read or what information we consume. How do we regulate what, to make sure that everyone's taking in as much diverse opinion as possible to have an informed decision? I mean, it becomes then we're starting to control people almost. I don't know if there can be one public perfect sphere where we all talk and it's all very measured and controlled.
Oliver, what have you thought about the criticism you've received about like the public sphere idea? Do you think it's like, achievable having one?
Well, it wouldn't be one public square. It would be essentially treating all to social media companies that are, I don't know how you would quantify that, but things like Facebook, Twitter, the big sort of monopolies, big tech monopolies almost, they would be regulated as public utilities and have to obey the First Amendment or whatever constitution is in that country that they're operating in, or face fines. And I think the alternative, which both Trump and Biden support for different reasons, is to remove the publisher protections. Trump wants to do that to sort of scare them into sort of leaving him and his followers alone, and Biden wants to do it to try and bring some more censorship into proceedings, because that would encourage social media companies to censor more, because they would want to cover their own backs and just get rid of things preemptively.
Well, that actually leads quite well into another question I was going to ask. It was going to be, why can't a group of reasonably minded people just control the public debate? Why can't it be in the hands of a group of people who are very of a good temperament and will just say that's allowed, that's not allowed, kind of what Twitter's doing now? Because Holly did mention that idea of it's very difficult calling the shots on things like fake news and whatnot, and you don't know where it will lead, so they might have to act somewhere. So what's your thoughts on that? Why can't they make those decisions on other people's behalf? Oliver?
I'd say that essentially what you're describing there is a dictatorship or even monarchism, but I think the only difference is that Queen Elizabeth has far more class than Jack Dorsey. So, I mean, that's who it would be. It would be people like Jack Dorsey, these sort of know-it-alls with sort of Harvard educations, and I don't think the majority of people want them telling them what to believe or think and how they should act or what they can and can't say.
What's your thoughts on that, Rafe? A group of really reasonably minded people controlling online debate and discussion and exposure to fake news and deciding what's, is it possible? Is it achievable? Or is it just going to lead to disaster? Or like a monarchy, as Oliver says?
I mean, it'd just be a wee bit odd. I would just emphasize focusing on just good journalistic practice, on, journalists doing a very good job, and hoping that will have cut through. That's probably the best approach. I wouldn't over-regulate the space. I wouldn't try to restrict and sort of have thought leaders, perhaps, because it just creates a very odd atmosphere online. it's just important to ensure that when you're reporting well, I think.
Holly, what's your take on that? People, do you like, fake news as a problem, and like, how do they curtail that? Do you think it's all right that these people in tech and like Twitter, for example, can pick and choose what people see?
I think the thing is the publications, for example, that do publish these things rooted perhaps more in imagination than fact, do face some comeuppance for it. I mean, they become untrustworthy publications at the end of the day, and I'm sure perhaps that would happen if that was going to start happening on social media as well. If everything started being able to pass through Facebook, maybe you'd gravitate away from it. Or if, I don't know, something on Twitter then started to become extremely targeted, then maybe you'd steer away from it as well. I think humans aren't daft. We know when we're being controlled, I think, well, maybe not all of the time, but I think certainly I don't agree with this idea of one committee. I mean, who picks that committee of who says what? And how do we then decide, well, we need one person like this, we need one person like that? I don't think that's going to work for a lot of it.
Okay.
Can I also say that,
yeah, go for it.
I mean, back in 2018, conspiracy theorist Alex Jones over in America, who runs Infowars.com, which is seen as this sort of outlet for sort of wild right-wing conspiracy theories, he was the first person, I believe, to be completely banned almost from the internet. His website's the only thing that remained. Banking apps banking services have stopped providing him. He's banned from every single platform. It's called the sort of internet death penalty. But he claims to be a journalist. He claims to be putting out reports. He does do news shows and radio broadcasts to 6 million listeners or something like that. So if we don't take a principled approach, then we start giving power to people, whether it's the state or big tech, to decide who can and can't be a journalist. And that's quite a dangerous proposition. And I'd say that the worst practitioner of a right justifies the curtailment of the right. So they'll go after extreme cases like climate change deniers and things like that to justify people who are far less concerning.
Rafe, do you think that's interesting about the internet death penalty? Do you think there's people who are sort of making an example of like extreme figures like Alex Jones and applying it to much more moderate people who might align with him in some sort of distant way?
Not necessarily. I think it's important to sort of caution, I guess, the caution an idea that these people have as much reach as they do. I often sort of something when covering COVID across the last 6 odd months, and we focus on things like anti-vax sentiment, and this is often coming from individuals who are on that sort of fringe. We've still got very positive, a very positive public outlook towards vaccinations. It's a very small number of people who are going to take that extreme view, and it's very hard to have cut through with them. But with the vast majority, if you're sort of reporting well and you're relaying the information on, say, vaccine development properly, you just reinforce trust in that. And that's why we've got a very good sort of vaccine uptake in the UK.
That's an interesting point about COVID and health and everything. Holly, what do you think that's a problem? People sort of having a political agenda behind the scenes and targeting extreme cases to make sort of, shut down people who align with them in some sort of very distant way. What do you think on that? Or is that conspiratorial?
I think, of course, like that probably happens. It does happen, I'm sure, in cases, but I think a lot of the ones that we'll be familiar with, those big names where things have happened, if we want to call it cancel culture, then a lot of the time it has been because they are saying harmful things. And I'm not familiar with a ridiculous amount of cases where it has been targeted in that way, but I'm sure it really does happen. It's a really difficult conversation to kind of navigate in regards to that. I mean, of course, everything's going to be slightly politically motivated. Everything's a little bit political at the end of the day. So I can't say how much is, how much isn't.
Oliver, what was your take on what Rafe said about I'm sure he didn't support like the internet death penalty regarding like COVID people, but like, you know, sort of silencing the COVID voices that were anti-vax and everything in the interest of public health.
I think anti-vax sentiments are a fantastic example. I think Europe has the highest rate of anti-vax sentiment anywhere in the world, I believe. And there's the record low trust in the media, things like that. And censoring people and shutting down debate and discourse rather than getting scientists to come out and debunk the myths that are put forward. That gives credence to the conspiracy theory. If someone starts shouting from the rooftops and you shut them down, people start taking an interest in what they're saying. So anyone who's been censored suddenly becomes a victim, and their audience grows. It doesn't disappear. Just look at Trump. They're not going to brush Trump under the carpet. He will get his voice out one way or another.
Well, you know, Holly brought something quite interesting, that she supported the, you know, when cancel culture happens, it's because people have said horrible things. Do you think the freedom that someone has to say horrible things that you might disagree with is sort of like just a piece of society that's falling into, you know, sort of the dustbin of history? You know, I wrote in the question, like, every generation has things that they've been, if it's like, you know, the corset or, you know, slavery, or like, and then of course they really push forward on certain issues. Is this just our sort of thing we're gonna follow away? Do you think it's just become an unpopular, is it an unpopular asset of society that just people aren't really into in today's society? What do you think about that, Oliver?
I'd say free speech has existed since the beginning of human history. It's about as human as breathing. I mean, cavemen would say that's a poisonous bush, there's a saber-toothed tiger around there, and people would survive, and that's how civilizations were built. So free speech, human rationality, that's integral to being a human. And every revolution, every rebellion, every political campaign is hinged on free speech. So it's something that we should cherish dearly.
What do you think about, Holly? Do you think freedom of speech and the right to express whatever you want is sort of like deeply unpopular now in society, and will just be, you know, fall out of fashion in the next decade or two? What do you think?
Well, I don't think being able to speak will fall out of fashion. I think that people will always want to express their opinion, and I don't think that's the issue at stake here. I don't think anybody is trying to say you have. Well, maybe there's a small percentage, but I think a lot of the people who are trying to create a safer society for people aren't trying to say you can't have an opinion. That is not what is being said here whatsoever. It is just ensuring that we aren't facilitating areas for where things like incitement for crime or hate crime happen. Sorry, you're still on mute, Maurice.
I'm getting used to this. What do you think about that, Rafe? Do you agree with Holly?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the notion of and just on Oliver's point as well, I think the notion of free speech is something that's existed for a long time, but it's been narrowly applied, right? It's not something that everyone has had access to. You know, it's a fairly sort of modern notion if we're talking about a wide-reaching, expansive coverage of it. And like I said earlier, when we were talking about things like, when I was talking about things like investigative work, and the risk of, you know, facing prosecution for that work, those are the things that need to be protected. And I think there is an emphasis, I think, even with things like the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, fundamentally entrenched in that is a freedom to be seen as equivalent in society and able to speak freely and act freely in a way that other people are able to. So I don't see it falling to the wayside. If anything, I think the idea is now that we need to sort of have a more far-reaching, all-encompassing system which allows lots of people to be able to speak freely without fear of prosecution or persecution internationally, especially.
What sort of things do you think shouldn't be allowed or shouldn't be published in a student publication, Holly?
So as editor of the publication that I manage, we try to be as unbiased as possible. We are the university's only official student newspaper, so we try and take as much political views as possible. We want as many diverse writers as we can. In terms of things that they shouldn't write about, I think it's fairly obvious to state nothing that's going to be discriminatory, defamatory, hateful in that regard. But I think that there's certainly been this idea, I think it was raised, MPs sent a letter to Boris Johnson about student unions and their ability to express political views. I think that's, and how they like to minimize that, really. I think that's wrong. I think students have a voice and they should be able to use it. And I hope that in my newspaper, that's an opportunity.
What sort of things do you not think should be published in a publication, Oliver?
I think shouldn't and couldn't are different. Shouldn't's down to taste, and that's down to the taste of the editor. And couldn't, I guess, would be things that are criminal and already covered by sort of hate speech legislation or Official Secrets Act or whatever it may be. But again, I think there is a problem with free speech universities. Pro-life societies are probably at the spear tip of this. They've been censored from various unions who are, broadly pro-choice as a matter of policy. And there's been various lawsuits, one in Aberdeen and one in Glasgow as well. And the universities have lost because in UK law, you do have the right to belief and thought and speech. And if it's allowed to be said on a campus, it should be allowed to be written in the opine section of a newspaper. I think that's a good standard to take.
And Rafe, what do you think shouldn't be published in a student publication?
Oh, I mean, like, as a former editor and just thinking about sort of student publications, I think you had a previous speaker on talking about sort of what a student publication is for. I think student publications are much more narrowly bound than the wider press. They also, don't have the same sort of financial clout to sort of defend themselves against things. So Holly and I have worked on things in the past where we've done, looked at investigative work and we haven't been able to publish because there have been legal barriers to it. I think the student space is quite narrow in that sense. It's quite tricky to publish things. I mean, Ollie's right, you can write, if you can say it on campus, you can probably write about it. I think student publications are a fairly nice area for lots of people to experiment with their writing as well. It's not the same as the national press in that regard. But there's also sort of safeguarding issues, and that's something that we've touched upon earlier. And you always want to look after your team and their welfare, and make sure that things that are being written aren't sort of, sometimes it's a case that a line can be taken out of an article and the rest can be published. And that's great. Sometimes a whole article can't be published. It happens. And that's just a judgment call.
Great answers, guys. Well, that's us at the 10-2 mark. So I think that's going to be our last question on our very interesting discussion. I loved it. I thought we all performed really well, and it was just brilliant, fantastic. It's even starting to snow outside. So yeah, I guess I'll just end it here. Basically, that was. Oh yes, and before we leave, the awards are going to be on at 7 p.m. tonight on the SPA Twitter account. Student Publication Association Twitter account. It's going to be SPA Journalism. That's the username. And yeah, they're all going to be announced. Who's the winners, and fantastic. How brilliant. Anyway, it was great having you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Cheers.